the conversion of inspiration to perspiration, what is it going to take?
Why can't the Indian private sector have the confidence and the conviction to do things that are actually what are required for India? Nakal karni hai to usko akal se karna hai na. We tend to actually get very pessimistic whenever there is a global shock rather than focusing on our strengths. Give me three things. I would say jobs, jobs and jobs. Now I was looking at and saying, hey, here's something that actually US doesn't have, India has. I am a very impatient person when it comes to India, because by 2047, India will be older. We have to get rich before we get old.
Welcome to the IAMAI podcast. Today we'll be talking to Professor Krishnamurthy Subramanian, who, as you know, has been the Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India, a former Executive Director of IMF, and currently he is a Professor of Finance. And I'm delighted to share this with you. He has been recently conferred the prestigious Alumni Award for Professional Achievement by the University of Chicago, his alma mater. Welcome, Professor, to the show.
My pleasure.
We will straight get into the questions, and as I mentioned to you, my first set of questions are around macroeconomics, especially the current situation, global situation that we are facing, and how does it impact on our targets for 2047?
Subho, let me start with an example that I find quite inspiring at the country level. I want to use Japan from 1970 to 1995. Over a 25-year period, Japan grew its GDP in dollar terms by 25.6 times. Now, this was a period where there was significant uncertainty. If you would remember, the 1970s was when the biggest oil shock happened. That was the period when inflation in the US shot out. They had the stagflation, the interest rates went into double digits, and yet Japan was able to grow its economy close to 26 times. China, similarly, from 2000 to 2025 has also been able to grow its GDP so much. I think these are inspirations because the reason they are inspirations is that India similarly has strengths, especially the domestic economy. And here I think it is important to understand the structure of our economy. If you take GDP to be consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports, your consumption accounts for about 60% of our GDP, and that's domestic. Similarly, investment, only 1.5% of our investment comes from foreign investment. Remaining about 30% is actually domestic. So that's 60 plus 30, around 90. Close to 10% is government spending, a little more than that, because imports are more than exports and net exports are minus 2%. So together, if you look at actually the domestic absorption, which is a consumption plus domestic investment plus your government spending, that accounts for a bulk of our GDP. This is something that is really important, and therefore we actually must focus on domestic policies, ensure that the policies are ones that are actually more salutary to encouraging investment, because that is something that really India needs. I think we've gone through almost a 10-year cycle now where investment has not picked up. At its peak, it was about 38%. We need investment to get close to 40% of GDP. So it's actually the ease of doing business together with ease of financing that will bring investment, and that is the focus. I think we have to actually stop wringing our hands about the about the black swan events. They keep happening as they did happen in the past as well. But I think focus on good policies domestically to make sure that the domestic engines of consumption, investment and government spending are firing in the right directions to make sure that we achieve those targets.
So I have a couple of follow-ups on that, if I may.
Sure.
The first one is that the inspirational examples of Japan, China, and we can add South Korea to it perhaps.
Yep.
Two questions on that. The inspiration has to be converted into perspiration. Only then we'll get the outcomes.
Indeed.
And second, do you think our economy at this position, each one of them has singular histories. I don't want to go into them. Japan had a particular structure of industry. South Korea had a particular structure of industry, and China had a particular structure. Do you think we are anywhere close to that in terms of structure of our industry? B, and A, of course, the conversion of inspiration to perspiration. What is it going to take for us?
So I think my first response, Subho, is that structure of industries actually can change over a 25-year period. I think that is the first thing we have to remember. That is not something that is God-given. Over time, if you basically looked at before the 90s, India was not a service-oriented economy at all. And yet in the last 30 years, India became a service-oriented economy. So I think if we keep, thinking that the structure is something that is basically fixed, it's God-given, then I think we will not be able to think along the right directions. And that is why when I actually answered that question, I answered it at the macro level, not necessarily at the sectoral level, because sectoral levels are choices that we make, and that is really important too. Now, in terms of the perspiration, I think in perspiration, I alluded to it. I think domestic policy is the perspiration that we have to actually really ensure. And we can get into more of the details as we go along in the conversation, but I would signal ease of doing business, and I think this is where really reforms are desperately required, and ease of financing as well. These are the two really critical. You mentioned South Korea, and I think let me use that example, I think, to highlight especially the ease of financing. I've covered this in my book India at 100. I want to take a 60-year period, 1960 to 2020, to talk about ease of financing. In 1960, the ratio of private credit to GDP, which essentially captures the extent of credit creation in the economy, South Korea's was 6%. We were ahead of South Korea at 8% in 1960. Fast forward 60 years, despite bank nationalization happening even in South Korea's private credit to GDP ratio was close to 270%. India in 2020 is languishing at 58%. Where is 270% and where is 58%? And that is why actually credit went to export intensive sectors, credit went to manufacturing, which is why, for instance, today Indians import Daewoo cars and Samsung phones. If it had been flipped, and I think this is really important always from a policy making perspective, think about what could have been and therefore learn from that history to implement going forward. If India can actually focus on credit creation, on ease of financing, then I think I see no reason why this can't be reversed. If this had happened in the last 60 years, we would have possibly been exporting our Maruti cars and our Jio phones to South Korea, in contrast to what it is in the other direction.
Absolutely fabulous. I don't want to get you into sectors, as you said, it will take a longer conversation, but I personally believe that the building blocks for Viksit Bharat, the target that the Prime Minister has set up for all of us, is primarily social in nature, and we should be focusing on education, healthcare, and rural and agri-tech. I would like to have your views on how do we rebuild this building blocks so that we are able to achieve the targets that we have set up for ourselves for 2047.
So, Subho, let me just quickly clarify. I think in the first part of your question, you said that the sectoral analysis will require more time. I actually want to clarify. What I mentioned is that sectoral level is actually a choice that is made. We can keep talking about it forever, but I think the important insight we have to keep is that it is policy choice and the choice of basically which areas of innovation we want to focus on. That is what leads to sectoral allocation. That's what is quite important. So I think at the macro level, understanding that India basically has a lot of strengths domestic, we tend to actually get very pessimistic whenever there is a global shock rather than focusing on our strengths. I think whether it's actually a nation or an individual, there will always be strengths and there will be weaknesses. I think good individuals and good countries play to their strengths, utilize their strengths very well, while trying to cover for weaknesses. I think that is something that is really important. Now, to come to the social side, I think this is something that is really important. In my India at 100 book, I actually talked about 4 pillars. Of those 4 pillars, the first one is what I just we spoke about, the macro level focus on growth and growth alone. But the second one is social inclusion. I'll come to that and explain that in detail, but let me just cover the 2 others. I think the third is looking at wealth creation and wealth creators as a boon, not as a bane. I think that is the third pillar that I spoke about. And fourth, actually a virtuous cycle triggered by private investment. And that is why, when we, in response to your first question, the emphasis on investment is something that actually I heeded too. So let me come back to social inclusion. You talked about agriculture, talked about healthcare, education. All of these are really important. But in my opinion, actually, on top of these, I think there is an even more important imperative. If you ask me, Subho, as a policy maker, or let's say a former policy maker, if you wake me up at 3 a.m. and say, hey, Subho, what is it that keeps you awake at night, thinking about India? I would say, and if you ask me, say, give me 3 things, I would say jobs, jobs, and jobs.
Absolutely.
That is basically what, because, if we do not have job creation, over the next, and while we've been creating jobs, I think we need to be creating jobs at a rate higher than our GDP growth, given the domestic, the demographics that we have. So I'll give you my personal example to actually, just to anchor the idea of how important a job is. My father, I come from a humble family. My father lost his father when he was just 7 years old, and he could therefore only complete school. Many of his brothers basically worked in the informal sector. They just sort of, one of them worked as a waiter. My father, in contrast, basically got a job, starting in the Indian Railways. He was there in the clerical grade for a long time and then retired as an officer. But if he had not gotten that job in the Indian Railways, there is no way he could have been able to educate me and my brother, who's also a professor here at ISB. So just the fact that one person got a job in the formal sector actually made such a difference to to the entire family. That is what jobs do. I think just one person getting a job in the family actually uplifts the family. And if we all go back to our own careers, I think one of the days that we remember by far the best is the day when we got our first job. I think because it is so important to self-esteem as well. So these are really critical. Now, your follow-up question could be, what do we need to do for jobs? I think there are a lot of things that I've covered that in great detail in India at 100. But let me focus on one really critical thing, which is manufacturing sector. I think manufacturing sector, and here again we basically should be focusing on policy. We keep talking about how manufacturing sector growth has not happened, but I think it is about policy. Allow me to explain this. When you think about manufacturing sector firms, what are the inputs they need? They need land, they need labor, they need capital, they need power, they need logistics to transport what they manufacture, and they need scale as well, because when they are of a higher scale, their costs are lower, the average costs are lower. Now, when you think about it, each one of these 6 is about policy. So, and many of these are at the state level, except for capital. All the other 5 inputs are at the state level. So I think we really need manufacturing sector growth. Allow me to also provide one more reason why manufacturing sector growth is really critical. Recently, we had refrigerators and air conditioners, etc. Actually, there were limits being put on imports of that, right? Now think about, we're talking about 2047. By 2047, even in my worst case estimate, actually I've provided 3 estimates, in my book, we will be close to a $28 trillion economy if we grow at 6% as well. Now, even a $28 trillion economy, think about the middle class that will get created, the refrigerators they will need, the air conditioners they will need, the 2-wheelers, the 3-wheelers, the phones, all of those. If we have to import each one of these, my estimate is that at least 400 to 500 billion dollars every year is the amount of foreign exchange that we will require. That is close to the amount of foreign exchange we have the total stock of reserves. So if this is the case, we don't develop manufacturing end to end, and I'm not talking just about assembly in India. We have to do assembling because you can run only after you learn to walk. So we have to do the assembling, but we also have to manufacture end to end, because otherwise we'll be importing components, and for which we will need foreign exchange as as well. Now think about what will future governments have to do if we do not develop manufacturing in India. If we do not do that, if we don't do these reforms, as of yesterday, or with earnest and with urgency, then we will have to actually, future governments will have to put a restriction on imports of refrigerators, air conditioners, phones, all of that, and then we run the risk of going back to the license permit Raj, if we do that. So I think manufacturing is so critical for job creation, but also for the external sector. So from a social perspective, sector perspective, jobs is what I really will emphasize on, for social sector, because nothing leads to better social inclusion and economic inclusion like a job does, the way I actually, described. I think we can talk about education and healthcare as really critical because they do feed into job creation, but if you want, we can talk about that later. But I'll emphasize the importance of jobs for social inclusion.
So you mentioned jobs as manufacturing as basically the motherboard for creating jobs. Now, do we have a uniform strategy? Are we thinking what are the sectors where we have comparative advantages, where we can quickly, rise up in the manufacturing sector? Otherwise, we seem to be going all over the place. Today it is telecom, tomorrow it is semiconductors, day after tomorrow it will be refrigerators. I don't know where it's led up.
This is, Subho, you may have paid attention, we wrote about this in the economic survey. This is the 2020 economic survey. We identified exactly the sectors, that where India should be focusing on, given its comparative advantage. And I think, we spoke about that at that time. That's I'm talking about 2020. So we're 6 years hence. That assemble in India, start with that, and then ensure that reforms happen. I actually, one of the key things that I like thinking about is from the macroeconomic perspective. If you look at, as I spoke about, each of these 6 inputs that we spoke about in manufacturing, in typical Indian firm, faces anywhere between 15 to 20% higher cost on each of these inputs. Now, when you aggregate them, the cost of production actually becomes much higher. So the reason I'm focusing on the macro rather than at the sectoral level, and actually I'm sort of pushing back the second time on your sectoral level question, because these are actually far more importantly thought at the macro level. Think about what is the obstacle, and in my opinion here is the higher cost because for all of these 6 inputs. If we basically have these costs being reduced, then the market actually, entrepreneurs will decide where is the profitability and they will go in. I typically actually, and this is maybe my University of Chicago training, I don't think governments or even industry associations are good enough at actually picking sectors that will do well in the future. That is something for individual entrepreneurs to decide. It is the role of policy and the government to identify obstacles and then basically remove those obstacles so that the market can go and basically go where it's like where there is a vacuum, there will basically be water flowing in. That is the thought, and therefore I want to emphasize again this thought, and I hear that very often in a lot of conversations about sectoral level sector. No, I think that's not the way the thinking should be. Identify obstacles, remove those obstacles, and let then entrepreneurs basically move into sectors which basically are profitable. Think about it, in the 1990s, did the Indian government, or late 80s, did the Indian government say that we should go into software? No, it was basically a Narayan Murthy, Tarun Ramudara at TCS, all of those, they moved into software. Similarly, when ITS came as well. So I think this thought about sectoral level that we can do winner picking about sectors, predict the future well, that is a thought that has to be abandoned. Just identify obstacles, remove those obstacles through policy, and let the market basically work its wonders.
I 100% agree with you, and I again go back to not a sector per se, but I'll want to now have you dive into the digital economy.
Yep.
And there, some of the factors that you mentioned, I would like to weigh in on those factors, how they are panning out. First of all, in the digital sector, from the vantage point or the disadvantage point that I have, I see that the government is again making the same kind of mistakes that it made in the earlier era of license permit Raj. It is offering product and service as well. It is playing in the market. It is creating the market. It is also regulating the market. So on one hand, you have digital public infrastructure like UPI, ONDC and the others. I would like you to talk a little bit about the value that they add. And also on the other hand, government is making policy. And then you have private sector player also like going the way as you just explained, innovating and creating new businesses and choosing which sectors they will put their monies and their efforts on. So let's talk a little bit about the government's role and the creation of the digital public infrastructure in the context of the overall digital economy.
So here, I will like to offer a different view, Subho. See, I'll go back to the first time I went to the United States. I went for my PhD in 2001. During that time, when I lived in the US, I used to keep thinking about, look at something in the US and say, hey, why can't this happen in India? That was the prism I always looked at. Now, recently, when I was there in the US for 3 years, now I was looking at and saying, hey, here's something that actually US doesn't have, India has, and I think especially the kind of digital public infrastructure. So between my period in the US from 2001 to 2010 and now, there's been a big shift. Actually, I'm seeing something in India that is there actually which the US does not do, and that's an important change. And here I think we have to give real credit to the government. Let me explain from an economics perspective why it is important. See, I actually am convinced that countries like the United States will never be able to develop the digital public infrastructure the way we have developed. And allow me to explain why, or even in Europe, why? Because something like that requires massive investments, right? And developing an infrastructure that basically has universal reach actually requires massive investment. When a private sector player makes that kind of investment, then that private sector player would want to recoup the value from that investment, which typically will lead to monopoly, because that kind of investment itself will become the entry barrier, and that generates a monopoly. And here's where actually from a policy perspective, I think a monopoly creates two important distortions. And they are sort of two sides of the same coin. One, a monopolist will typically price the product actually at very, very high, and that leads to access not being universal. So if, for instance, in India, the digital public, if for instance, Jan Dhan had not happened, and then after that, let's say the digital public infrastructure, if that UPI had not been created, we would not have DPI. And something like Jan Dhan or the UPI, it's very difficult in a country like the United States, because the entrenched players will basically see that their basically revenues and profits will get impacted, so they'll push back very strongly. I think this is where, when you have what economists call natural monopolies. Natural monopolies is one area where actually the government has a role, because if there is a private sector player that actually occupies the natural monopoly, that will lead to distortions. It will not lead to universal access. So let me give you a very anchoring example. I'm here at the Indian School of Business. Before I joined the government, I used to you go out of ISB campus here, there is a restaurant called Udupi. You actually can go and have coffee there. When I used to go before 2018, that person basically would charge 7 rupees for a coffee. So you drank the coffee and then you would take out change. He would take as much time to give you back the change, maybe 3 rupees or 43 rupees or 93 rupees, as he took to make coffee, right? Now, after I came back from government, I went and drank coffee the same place. He just makes coffee, and we basically pull out our phone, use the barcode there and pay. Now, as a result, he's become efficient. But that is not the end of the story, actually. And that is the next part is an even more powerful learning for me there, which is that earlier, because these are all cash and carry businesses, this coffee maker basically would get somebody bringing in milk in the morning, yes. And then they would come back in the evening to actually get repaid, because in the morning this coffee person did not have the cash to pay for the milk, but by the end of the day actually he would have had the cash, so that supplier of milk had to make 2 trips then. Now with digital infrastructure, he tells me, because I speak Telugu and I like asking these people, that's how one gets to understand the ground level things, right? So he was telling me that the person who supplies milk does not make the second trip anymore now. So think about actually the benefits that have come in the supply chain. Now this kind of benefit, actually universalization of payments, basically digital payments, would not have happened if the government had not done it. I think that is something that is really important. Now, there was a second part to your question. Let me answer that. And I think having built this infrastructure, to me, it is basically infrastructure, and the government has a role in that for sure. After that, I think it is best for the government to let the private sector, because efficiencies are far more in the private sector, let the private sector innovate and I think come up with very good solutions. I mean, if you look at something like an Uber or a Ola or anyone or Rapido, they've actually served a need, right? They've served a need that the customer has. Similarly, on the top of digital infrastructure, let many flowers bloom, let many private sector solutions come and bloom and create solutions for India. And this is an aspect that I actually like emphasizing, that our entrepreneurs actually need to be solving India's problems at India's scale, at Indian price points. That is when, and they should become rich for sure. They should basically, but they should look to solve problems, for India, at Indian price points, at India scale, not just mimic what is basically happening in the US, because that's where they will be able to, do good for themselves and at the same time do good for the country. Also create a lot of jobs in the process as well.
So don't you see any conflict between government providing, services through digital public infrastructure and also government making the whole policy mechanism?
So I think the role of the government,
as you know, when we are younger, we are taught that government should do one thing, otherwise there will be conflict of interest.
So I think Subho, let me share that what we might have learned 20-30 years back versus today. The economics itself as a discipline has moved on. The consensus has changed as well. Today, for instance, you have the World Bank talking about industrial policy. India, the Indian government was doing this, through the PLI during COVID itself. And you have World Bank. Now industrial policy was a word that was completely disbanded from the economic dictionary, for several decades, but it is back. Similarly, you have many countries emphasizing that important sectors need to be owned by domestic industry because of some of the problems that come. I think we are actually living in times that actually require newer solutions. I think economics as a discipline therefore also evolves. I think that nuance has to come in our discussion. Now with that, actually I still will say, as I already have answered, that India has to actually focus on developing these infrastructures and let the private sector, especially entrepreneurship, solve the problems. I think that is something, because eventually it is about efficiency, and where is it efficient? Basically, it is government is efficient at creating infrastructure, because that is what is that kind of investment no private sector entity can make. Even if they make, it will lead to distortions like monopolies, etc. So that is something the government should do. But once that is created, I think it is best left to the private sector to basically go and compete it out and thereby create value. That's the last bit about I think this is something the economic policy that basically around COVID that was announced, where the government announced, and this is something that it should be implemented, that except for a few strategic sectors, it basically, the policy very clearly mentioned that government has no business being in business. There's a lot the government already has to do, especially in terms of public goods, etc. So I think the focus should be on those areas rather than on those where basically its comparative advantage is not as high.
Absolutely.